Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is David Morrell. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's good to see you again.
You are one of my favorite writers. We've got a new book to talk about. Let me introduce you a little bit to our audience. You're a Canadian-American novelist, best known for your 1972 debut novel. Here is the original one.
First edition
of First Blood. And now, for those of you who are going to run right out, this is the new edition of First Blood. And why you know and love First Blood is it became
a novel, a movie starring Sylvester Stallone as Rambo, and then the many films that came after that.
And so there was a whole Rambo franchise.
Yes.
And it really, we'll talk about it in a minute, but it really, really changed. You are called the father of the modern action novel, because you took it in a whole new direction. Well, let's just talk about it now.
Okay.
So what did you do? Why was Rambo such a success? Why was First Blood such a success?
Well, there are two things. One is the substance, the character. The novel was published in 1972, and I started writing it in 1968, the year that there were hundreds and hundreds of riots in the United States, partially about civil rights and partially about the Vietnam War. And in a way, they're connected because there were an awful lot of black young men that went to Vietnam who couldn't get the deferment that some white people did. I was at Penn State at the time as a graduate student, and it was only people who lived through that time know how violent and tense and catastrophic it felt. And I got to thinking we were going to have a civil war. And what would happen if the Vietnam War came to the United States and the war happened here? And who would that be? And I thought maybe a disaffected soldier from Vietnam who had been radicalized by the war, who hated what he had learned about himself. And that character became Rambo. And when the novel was published in 1972, the Vietnam War was still going on, still lots of intensity. So it was timely. Mm-hmm. And for a first novel, it was reviewed everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere without looking at it. One review, most of the reviews were positive, all right, but one of them from Time magazine was essentially the negative one. And you're looking at me like you're going to ask about it.
Well, because it came up with that phrase, that it changed carnography.
Yeah. He accused, the reviewer for Time magazine said I had written, and this was the change. I had done something I realized that was different and was going to have an influence, because he called it carnography, the equivalent of pornography. And carnography to him was the meat novel, was violence in a way that had not been presented in a novel before.
Carnage
and carno meat, that sort of thing. And indeed, the novel changed, in terms of its subject matter, it changed things. But the other thing that it's harder to talk about was when I was at Penn State, I did my master's thesis on Hemingway's style. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not Hemingway, I don't pretend to be Hemingway, but I studied Ernest Hemingway's style for a long time, how he wrote action. And I thought one of the reasons he's revered is that he doesn't fall for the pulp expressions like a shot rang out.
The cliches. Yes.
And so when I wrote First Blood, I tried to find, in my own way, a way of writing action that hadn't been done before. And that part has influenced several generations of writers.
Because you actually changed the whole genre of action books and movies.
It did, yes.
You actually brought so much action. The old regular action movies would have 5 scenes of action in it. Out of the 96 minutes of the movie Rambo, 53 minutes of it were all action. And it's heart-pounding action. You're on the edge of your seat.
It changed when the movie was adapted, and it took 10 years for the culture to change, for them to figure out how to to do the film. Steve McQueen was going to be in it one time, but he was 45 years old and couldn't portray a young Vietnam veteran. But the idea by 1982 was how could you present the action but do it in a way that, in my novel, Rambo is very angry for what happened to him. By 82, and Sylvester with those wonderful eyes, he's more playing the victim. And there had never, until that time, been a movie with that much continuous action in it.
I think you said the comparison between your book, First Blood, and the movie was one was War is Hell and the other one is War is Heck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The movie, he throws a rock at a helicopter and a guy falls out, and there are a couple of faceless deputies that have a car crash, and we assume that perhaps they're killed. He destroys a lot of private property. So I sort of thought, well, it's War is Heck. But the novel's a whole different deal. It's War is Hell, because I wanted to show the effect that kind of training could have on somebody if they became accustomed to killing and hated themselves for it.
Well, it was one of the most watched and one of the most influential movies of the time. It hit a nerve, and even in Poland and in Berlin, it was like this was a revolutionary undercurrent that was embraced.
Yes. I was on tour in Poland in 2001, and journalists, it was unreal. There were hundreds of journalists who wanted to talk to me, and it's nice to be liked, but I understand my place in the pecking order, and this was unnatural. So what was going on? And about the third day, a very pleasant Polish journalist, a woman, she'd be about 35 perhaps. I mentioned the age because she said, "You don't understand what's going on here." And I didn't. She said, "You have to understand that during the Solidarity years, when we were protesting against the Soviet Union," and she would be the right age for that those protests. She said the Rambo movies were illegal, but we smuggled them in and we watched them, then put on bandanas as Rambo wears and went out to demonstrate. We used the movies to get ourselves worked up. And so she said to me, jokingly, but it's kind of cool to think about it, in his own way, Rambo helped bring down the Soviet Union.
Yeah, which would make Rambo very, very proud.
Yes.
But it's interesting because you said that you learned a lot from Hemingway, and one of the things I think you learned was to keep the everyday, cutting edge, what's current politics out of it. Mm-hmm. So now, generation after generation, soldiers of other wars it's still true for them.
In First Blood, the novel, I'm not even sure I mentioned Vietnam. If I do, it's once or twice. There are no contemporary politics in the novel, even though anybody at the time reading it would see the overtones because it's comparable to what they were seeing every night on television. But I knew, Hemingway said, think 10 years, 20 years ahead. Mm-hmm. What is there in there that's going to date itself and make the book look old-fashioned? And so I was rigorous in taking as much of the timeliness of 1968 up to 72 out of the book, and I continue to do that.
You continue to transform yourself. Now I'll go back to a little bit about your life. You are called the father of the modern action novel, which we just saw with First Blood. In 2009, you got the Thriller Master Lifetime Achievement Award for being a game changer, and this is voted on by a very elite group of, is it authors?
It's the International Thriller Writers Organization.
So they know whereof they speak.
Yes.
And you got the Lifetime Award.
It's a little embarrassing to talk about it, but it's a very fine award to have received.
You've gotten other awards, a Nero, Edgar.
The McCavity. I've been nominated for an Edgar, nominated for Anthony. I am a three-time, this is sort of interesting about the way I go back and forth, three-time Bram Stoker Award from the Horror Writers Association,
really?
and some other things. Comic-Con, the big comic convention, they have an Inkpot Award, and they gave me an Inkpot Award for a lifetime achievement in action and adventure. It's been nice to be recognized. It's a lonely life, day after day by yourself, with the craziness in one's imagination, putting it on the page, and it's nice to have real people outside my office recognize what I'm doing.
Well, with over 18 million copies in print, It may be lonely on one side, but it's not lonely out there. People are knocking each other down to get to these. You've got 29 novels, 31 books in all, translated into 26 languages.
Yes.
This is a terrific outreach. You're Canadian. I couldn't bring all 29 books, but I wanted to bring one of my favorites because this was a miniseries and an amazing book called The Brotherhood of the Rose.
I like to be able to say it was the only novel to be adopted into a miniseries that premiered after the Super Bowl.
Ah.
The only miniseries after a Super Bowl. Now, I have many friends who have done much higher bestseller lists than I have ever achieved,
But they haven't
they
been-
don't have that. So.
Yes, yes. So because this is, some young people are taken from orphanages and trained to be state-of-the-art espionage agents. But you also, you had spent some time in an orphanage yourself.
I did. When I was 3 years old, my father, I look a little younger than I am. My father died at D-Day. He was a pilot who flew ahead to see where the shells from the ships were landing, and he would report, and then they would adjust the cannon, and he was shot down. My mother, time passed, and my mother eventually, she was a wonderful seamstress. She was very talented. But she couldn't work and keep me at the same time. It was she was going to starve. She had to work. So she put me in an orphanage for a time. And after that, she put me on a Mennonite farm. I lived on a Mennonite farm for a while. Very interesting. I learned how to chew. His name was Wilfred Shantz, and he had a thing about chewing food, and you had to chew 50 times every bite. So I learned how to count when I was 4 years old to 50 because I was chewing. And I remember it quite fondly. I even used his name, Wilfred, as the first name for the police chief in First Blood. And then my mother remarried, and they didn't get along, and there was a lot of fighting, and I slept under the bed. I was terrified. I lived and it was a very fearful youth. And basically, I told stories to myself under the bed, and they were adventure stories in which I was the hero and I was saving people. You can see the psychological mechanism, but in a way, someone once asked Stephen King why he wrote horror, and there's kind of a snooty tone to that. And he said, "What makes you think I have a choice?" And the same thing would apply to me. Why do I write thrillers? I was programmed from when I was a kid, and it's something I feel very at home with. And at the same time, as we've discussed elsewhere, it's a wonderful opportunity to have an audience, and you can still be literary in the thriller format.
But at age 17, who should drive into your life? Route 66.
Oh, I love to talk about that.
I know. It's wonderful because you've described your childhood in Canada and the difficulties of it, and suddenly here another image, another way of living is presented to you.
I was adrift. I watched 10 to 12 hours of television a night, very unhappy. And my school principal, in fact, made me come out of class and go to his office and pointed at me. He said, "You're never going to amount to anything," trying to get me to shape up. Well, what could I say? Television made me in a way. Route 66 was a classic TV series about two young men in a Corvette convertible driving across the United States. The promos were in search of America and in search of themselves. And I was so rootless, I identified with them, and both of them were orphans. One had been an orphan from childhood, the other had recently lost his parents. So I identified with that. And the scripts were an unusual blend of very, very intelligent, lots of philosophy with a lot of action. And almost all of them were written by a man with a very distinctive name, Sterling Silliphant.
Yeah.
Silliphant had also written for Naked City. He eventually received an Oscar for adapting John Ball's novel In the Heat of the Night. Well, at the age of 17, I went to a library, asked, Screen Gems was the production company. So I'm no dimwit. I thought, how can I get in touch with him? I'll go to a librarian. Love librarians. And they gave me, one librarian gave me the address for Screen Gems. And I wrote Sterling a handwritten letter. And a week later, he responded. apologizing for being late. He was out at sea, he said. But when he came in, he immediately answered. And he told me basically the secret to write is to write and to keep doing it until you find somebody who can help you. He said it's that simple and that difficult. And that was the way it was. And he and I became pen pals, as it were. And eventually in 1985, something I remember vividly, our paths crossed. And we spent the 4th of July weekend together, almost like father and son. This is a big thing for me, looking for a male authority figure that would be like a father. And he said, what are you working on? And I told him about Brotherhood of the Rose. It had just come out. And he said, I think NBC should do, he was a favorite writer of those. He said, NBC should do an action miniseries. So he went to the head of production there, Susan Bearwald at the time, and she said, yes, let's do it. And when it premiered, I had a kind of full circle because Sterling was the executive producer on it. So we got to work together as well as to be friends. And I just loved the guy.
Well, we're speaking today with David Morrell, who's called the father of the modern action novel and all that, but you have shifted, so we've got to kind of fast forward to this. You've changed genres completely, and I'm wondering what made you change, and then let's talk about where you've gone.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so what made you change from the action, because there's so many of them and they're so good.
Well, one of the things, this is my 43rd year as a writer, as a published novelist, and that is an eternity in the publishing world where some careers last 20 years if they're successful. What can happen is that a writer finds something that works and repeats it and repeats it and repeats it. And what happens is a fatigue factor, both with the writer and with readers. And so I, again, looking ahead, 10 years, 20 years, I thought, I could have written more novels like First Blood. But in the 80s, I thought of writing espionage novels that would be unusually accurate about the tradecraft for the time, Brotherhood of the Rose being an example. In the 90s, I wrote other kinds of thrillers, and we'll move forward. I need, I guess, to keep interested. This is creation after all. So in 2009, we had a family tragedy. My granddaughter, 14 years old, Natalie, died from a rare bone cancer that had also killed my son in 1987. Only 200 people get the disease each year in the United States, and it is not believed to be inherited. It's called Ewing sarcoma. So in 2009, my wife and I were not only grieving for this poor child who'd suffered unimaginably, and at the same time, I called it grief twice observed, because I was also thinking about what had happened long ago with our son, while our daughter was going through it, so to speak, for the first time. And she became interested in all kinds of movies and books about grief. And one of them was called Creation, a movie about Charles Darwin's fiction. I mean, it's a biopic, if we want to call it that, about Charles Darwin's nervous breakdown when he was suffering from grief over the death of his favorite daughter. He had heart palpitations, headaches, insomnia, stomach issues, and all of that. But the doctors at the time couldn't find a physical explanation. In the movie, near the end, a character shows up. It's one of those moments, it's like when I was 17 and watching Route 66. And if you listen, if you're receptive, things grab you. And the character comes on and says, Charles, there are people like Thomas De Quincy who believe that we can be controlled by thoughts and emotions we don't know we have. Well, this is supposed to be the 1850s. That sure sounds like Freud. So I wondered if the filmmakers were making all this up, that it was an anachronism, or whether De Quincy had, in fact, whoever he was, had, in fact, anticipated Freud. So I ran off as soon as I still have all my college textbooks, and I started researching De Quincy, and sure enough, he invented the word subconscious, and he anticipated Freud's psychoanalytic theories by 70 years.
He was also the first, his book, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, was the first literary work about drug dependency.
Yes. Isn't that a great title? Confessions of an English Opium
It
Eater.
is, but let's talk about this.
Yes.
Because his drug of choice was,
Laudanum.
and this is an antique laudanum
It is.
bottle.
$250 I had to pay for that.
And that was
old
empty.
bottle. It
What
was
it would have
empty.
been, because
Oh, I'd
laudanum
have been arrested.
was a
yeah.
combination of alcohol
And powdered opium.
and opium. The alcohol of choice was often brandy.
Yes.
Wow. And so the usual dosage for an adult is
20 drops. There was a stopper, and you'd go like this into a glass of water.
and what because
well,
of,
at his height, you have to do systems of measurement were a little different. He confessed sometimes 2,000 drops a day when the normal was 20. And if we translate this and we go for the worst of his addiction, if we allow that maybe a teaspoon, if you drank that, you'd probably die. He was drinking 16 ounces
Wow.
of it a day, while a friend of his said watched him eating opium pills like they were filberts.
so you went from this painful tragedy in your life and threw yourself back in time and space to
Yes.
1855 London. Your first book, based with De Quincy, the historical figure as a fictional character,
Yes.
is Murder as a Fine Art, which was named one of the best thrillers of.
Oh, it was so gratifying. It was a big
People
risk for
loved
me.
it.
Big
Yes.
risk for me. I had many of my fellow authors say, it's a big jump. It's, you're American modern subjects, and you're going to go across the river, across the ocean, and you're going to go back all those years, and look at the mistakes you might make. They're going to say, you don't know what you're doing. And so I spent 2 years, I was escaping. I mean, you can see the mechanism. I was so unhappy, and the modern world isn't that wonderful anyhow. I mean, granting, we have health care and all that, but every day there seems to be a new assault of indecency, and in the broadest sense. And so I began, there's a Richard Matheson movie. The novel was called Bid Time Return, and the movie is called Somewhere in Time, where someone concentrates hard enough that he goes back to the turn of the century. And I thought, I wonder if I can concentrate hard enough to go back to 1854 London, which is when De Quincy had published On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts.
Postscript on murder. Yeah,
Yes.
right. Yeah.
It's the third installment. He called it a postscript. There's 3 parts of it, and in which he invented the modern true crime genre
Yes.
by meticulously, I call them 50 blood-soaked pages, meticulously recreated the infamous Ratcliff highway murders of 1811. And these murders were the first mass media murders in English history because of the way mail coaches could take newspapers all across the country in 2 days. And these murders were so ghastly, they shut down England. And De Quincy, all those years later, 1854 from 1811, still remembering the terror and recreating them on the page. And I thought, this is so cool. What I'll do is I'll have at 1854, the essay just comes out, and somebody decides to use it so
Yeah.
so
but
detailed.
it's so self-reflective. A mirror in a mirror. It's a hall of mirrors.
Yeah, it is.
How you use it. And this book, De Quincy's influenced Poe, who influenced Arthur Conan Doyle, and which then became Sherlock Holmes. This whole genre, you're right, the whole true crime genre, and you are resonating with it in your own Murder as a Fine Art. We're almost out of time. I must celebrate your new book, Inspector of the Dead. You are not harnessed. It's historical. You blend historical fact and fiction.
De Quincy is back again. Again, it's a major crime that changed Victorian culture. In this case, it was the 7 men who tried to assassinate Queen Victoria. It isn't well known, but she was a target throughout her life. And the novel it's an interesting moment in English history. And the Crimean War was raging in February of 1855. The reports about the incompetence of the British commanders were such that the government toppled. For 1 week, no one was in charge, and I thought, well, I'll have somebody try to assassinate the queen, and if it works, the whole thing will fall down, the whole empire. And he leaves notes at various crimes with the names of the different people who tried to assassinate the queen. The point being, when he runs out of names, she's next.
She's next.
And De Quincy gets involved because he's an expert in psychology. So he, to get into the mind of a man who would want to do that, and using four Freud theories in order to find the guy.
Well, it's been so well received, and it's so exciting. You also do a structural thing, that the form and the content, you play with the idea of a Victorian novel, but you've got Emily, his daughter's journals in there to give you some first and third person, and it's set back against this incredible time in British history when Queen Victoria was so vulnerable. But you also augmented online because of our modern sensibilities. You have these photo essays about some of the locations and famous buildings where these events in your book, Inspector of the Dead, actually took place. The Crystal Palace, the Mayfair, St. James Church, all of these things. So it resonates on so many levels. You've done such a good job. Plus, what we learn about the class differences, you really, really studied this. I'm horrified that we've run out of time. I just want to tell you, our guest is David Morrell. This new one, Inspector of the Dead.
Learn a lot about the Victorian world in ways you never imagined.
And the other thing that you have done, this is my favorite book about writing ever, The Successful Novelist. This is, what do people say, that this is the only book you need? But it's really, and it's written almost in the style of one of your thrillers.
It's 43 years of experience.
You're doing something right. So, what are you working on now?
I'm working on a third De Quincy. I always thought of them as a trilogy, and part of it would be about in the first Murders of Fine Art, he's entertaining as an opium addict. In the second book, we begin to see, particularly because of his daughter Emily, who's really a major character, the idea being that if Emily loves him, we'll love him.
Yeah, it works.
Because we have this, there's a disinclination maybe to accept him as a main character. But there's a cost. At one point in the book, one of the Scotland Yard detectives they work with asks her to marry him, and she says, I have such a responsibility with my father. How can I look beyond that? I mean, she gives the example when he wrote, and he'd use a candle, and he's leaning over, and she said, Father, your hair's on fire again. And he, is it, Emily? And then he would, this is a true story. He kept setting fire to himself. So I needed, at a certain point, to say, yes, he's very, very witty and very amusing, but there's a cost.
But I have to translate into our modern terms with Inspector of the Dead. People who read it, their hair is on fire. You cannot stop reading this. So thank you for your gifts that you've given us.
Thank you.
David Morrell, thank you for joining us today.
It was fun. Thanks so much.
You bet. And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.